Okay, so let's take a look at the subsection development of the DSM-5-TR, which is a subsection to the introduction section of the DSM-5-TR. So I pulled out a few excerpts here that I thought were important. Two central themes in this first here subsection, I suppose, brief history of the prior DSM editions is two things. One, that the DSM has become increasingly more collaborative. Uh, not like obviously a book is not a human book itself is not collaborative, but meaning that the book is more integrated. Maybe is a good word for it with other organizations that are involved in diagnostic and classification of diseases and disease or behavioral health condition research. So you see here just some of the collaboration: the World Health Organization, the NIMH, the NIAAA, NIDA, as an example, just to see that just so there's evidence that there's partnership in different all kinds of different aspects of the behavioral health ecosystem, both from a macro and clinical, as well as clinical standpoint, which you'll see in the field trials part. I think the other piece to this prior history section is I pulled out the conflict of interest section, and I actually probably wouldn't have done that except for the fact that earlier in early 2004 there was a bit of a, I don't know if scandal is the right word. You can read the attached article if you want. You're not by any means required to. I can open it for you just quickly here. Hopefully it'll open quickly. So there's an article here about from a journal. What is the journal called? It's not. Oh, sorry, I'm not seeing the immediate name of the journal. It's not super relevant. But anyway, so that worked its way around, so some discussion among the faculty or that involved in teaching this course. By the time you're viewing this, it may not be something that is of any public notice at all. But because that did come up, I wanted to make sure that we didn't ignore it. So there's two things. One, just an acknowledgement that those allegations were brought to bear, and that the DSM, within the DSM, in this particular section of the DSM, there's text on the conflict of interest processes that are part of the development of the DSM. So you can read all that and judge for yourself. And by the way, you do not have to read that attached article. And this is not something that I would, that would be an examination, a test, a final exam question. It's really just because it came up, I wanted to acknowledge it and just have a few words about it in the content, in the lecture content. Okay. Again, so these things are just about the sort of processes. I think it's good to have just a high level familiarity with how the DSM is, the processes of formulating different versions in the last couple of versions of the DSM, meaning the DSM-5, which came out around 2013, I think, and then the DSM-5-TR, which was published in 2022. So you just see some guided principles to revisions. I think they're self-evident. Ask me if it doesn't seem that way. So field trials, I just pulled out what I thought was the most salient aspect of that. Again, it's not something you need to have deep knowledge of, but just have just an understanding that when diagnostic changes are made, or a new diagnosis is being developed or proposed to be developed, or significant revision to an existing diagnosis, these things are researched in actual clinical settings. All right, and that's really all you need to know about that. And of course, there's a little bit more about the mechanisms, how that works in the reading, as you know. So there's also a cycle or a number of cycles of public comment and opportunities for public feedback when there's a new version of the DSM being published. So just gives you just a little, really, again, what you want to know from that is that there is part of this process of developing a new version of DSM is this cycle or number of cycles of public comment, of getting outside feedback outside of the committees, the various committees that are ultimately the authors of the book. All right, and then there's a little bit more about just the final review process. Again, this is just only need to have sort of light working knowledge of sort of mechanisms of how the DSM is developed. Okay. And again, here revisions. I think maybe this is slightly more. This might be a tad more important, but just to understand how changes are made, whether it's a change to an existing diagnosis or the addition of a new diagnosis or regrouping of a diagnosis, for example. And sometimes these can be significant. One of the things, for example, that is now quite old, but people, it hasn't fully sort of been absorbed into the behavioral health profession, is that the diagnosis of Asperger's was eliminated when the DSM-5 was published. Wasn't so much eliminated as it was subsumed into autism spectrum disorder, and we'll touch on that a little bit when we get into the neurodevelopmental section. But there's, like, I hear people use Asperger's all the time, professionals too, and that diagnosis has not existed in this. It doesn't exist in this current version, and it didn't exist. It was not added. It was taken out of the last version as well. So this gives you just a little bit of, and that's just purely an example. It's not something you're going to be tested on. It's just an anecdote. But this is so this just gives you some ideas on how what the reasons for change, as well as what are the different methods of validating diagnostic criteria. And so looking at biological, including genetic aspects, as well as environmental factors and neurological factors, other biomarkers. So there's definitely a strong biology standpoint that we don't get deep. We're not going to get deeply into here. Just understand that that's part of how these diagnoses are formed. That there's consideration of research evidence around biology, biomarkers, neurology, as part of including. We're focused more on the social aspects, the incorporation of more social and cultural aspects of a person's life as it affects their health, is our bigger focus that we'll have in this course. Okay, there are 20 disorder groups, meaning there's 20 groups of looking at different, either different diagnoses or clusters of diagnoses. You don't need to know the details on that. You might see a question because it's a useful multiple choice question, like what were the 4 cross-cutting groups? And that means that essentially, practically what that means, for every cluster or diagnosis, a cluster of diagnoses or diagnosis itself, aspects that were looked at in terms of the diagnostic criteria and how the section is written up in each diagnosis are culture, sex and gender, suicide considerations, and forensic or legal considerations. Okay. The other thing that was done, and I think really for the first time in the DSM processes, I'm not 100% sure about that, but what I am sure of is that it was discussed a lot more in this book and articles around the book than previously, and that is paying more attention to the type of language and terms that are used and considering consideration of stigmatizing versus non-stigmatizing language. Okay, so that's just a bit of additional context for those subsections of the introductory section of the DSM.